Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The horrifying case of the Rogers family cabin that burned alive. The winter wind howls through the Ozark Mountains, carrying with it whispers of a tragedy so disturbing that even today, more than a century and a half later, locals still speak of it in hushed tones. It was December of 1863, and the snow lay thick upon the ridges and hollows of what would become the border between Missouri and Arkansas. The Civil War raged across the nation, but in these remote mountains, something far more sinister was about to unfold. Picture, if you will, a night so cold that the very air seemed to crack with frost. The moon hung pale and distant above the peaks, casting eerie shadows through the bare branches of oak and hickory. In a secluded hollow, miles from the nearest neighbor, stood a modest log cabin that had sheltered the Rogers family for nearly a decade. By morning, nothing would remain but ashes, charred timber, and a mystery that would haunt the Ozarks forever. The first sign of trouble came not as smoke or flame, but as sound, a sound so terrible that those who heard it would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but thunder that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than descend from the heavens. Then came the screaming. Mrs. Abigail Hendricks, living some 3 miles away across the ridge, would later swear before God and man that she heard those screams carrying on the winter wind, not the brief cries you might expect from a house fire, but prolonged, agonized wailing that seemed to go on for hours. What made her testimony so chilling was not just what she heard, but when she heard it. According to Mrs. Hendricks, those screams continued long after the flames had died down, long after any human voice should have been silenced. When dawn broke gray and bitter over the hollow, the first neighbor to investigate found only a smoldering ruin. The cabin had been reduced to little more than a foundation of blackened stones and a pile of ash so fine it might have been flour. But it was what wasn't found that truly disturbed those early investigators. Where were the bodies? Where were the bones? In a typical house fire, even the most devastating blaze leaves something behind: fragments of bone, metal objects, anything that might prove human beings had once lived and died there. The Rogers cabin had yielded nothing. It was as if the family had simply vanished into the smoke itself. To understand the full horror of what happened that December night, we must first understand the world in which the Rogers family lived and died. The year 1863 marked the bloodiest period of the Civil War in Missouri and Arkansas, a time when the line between combatant and civilian had all but disappeared. These were not the neat, organized battles you might read about in history books, but a savage guerrilla war that pitted neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The Ozark Mountains had become a lawless frontier where Confederate bushwhackers and Union jayhawkers conducted brutal raids with impunity. Regular army units from both sides swept through the region like locusts, requisitioning supplies, burning suspected enemy strongholds, and leaving devastation in their wake. Just months before the Rogers tragedy, the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas had claimed thousands of lives, while the town of Cassville, Missouri, had been evacuated and burned to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. In this chaos, isolated families like the Rogers found themselves caught between opposing forces, never knowing whether the next group of armed men to approach their door would be friend or foe. Trust became a luxury few could afford, and suspicion poisoned even the most innocent interactions. A man's political loyalties could mean the difference between protection and death, and the wrong word spoken in the wrong company could bring midnight visitors with torches and rope. The newspapers of Springfield, Missouri, during this period, paint a picture of a region consumed by violence and paranoia. Headlines spoke of midnight raids, savage reprisals, and mysterious disappearances. One particularly disturbing account from the Springfield Republican described finding entire homesteads abandoned, their occupants vanished without explanation, leaving behind only scattered belongings and unanswered questions. It was into this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the Rogers family had tried to carve out a peaceful existence. They were, by most accounts, decent people attempting to survive extraordinary circumstances. But as we shall see, their very efforts to remain neutral in an unneutral world may have sealed their fate. Thomas Rogers was a man marked by war long before the current conflict began. Those who knew him described a tall, lean figure with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. The scars on his hands and arms told stories he rarely shared, souvenirs, some said, of the Mexican-American War, where he had served as a young man. Others whispered of darker origins for those marks, connecting them to his wife's unusual practices and the strange atmosphere that seemed to surround their remote homestead. Thomas had brought his family to the Ozarks in 1854, seeking the isolation these mountains provided. He built their cabin with his own hands, choosing a location deep in what locals called Red Hollow, a name whose origins were already lost to memory, though some claimed it came from the color of the clay soil, while others insisted it referred to blood spilled in some forgotten conflict with the Cherokee. Whatever his reasons for seeking solitude, Thomas Rogers was a man who valued his privacy above all else. He traded infrequently with his neighbors, appearing in the nearest settlements only when necessity demanded. When he did emerge from his hollow, he conducted his business quickly and quietly, speaking only when spoken to and volunteering nothing about his family's affairs. His wife, Eliza Rogers, was perhaps even more enigmatic. Born Eliza Whitmore in the Tennessee mountains, she had brought with her to the Ozarks a knowledge of herbs, remedies, and what she carefully termed the old ways. In a time and place where trained physicians were scarce, such knowledge made her both valuable and suspect. Neighbors would seek her out when conventional medicine failed, when children burned with fever, or when difficult births threatened both mother and child. Eliza's remedies worked more often than not, earning her a reputation that spread throughout the region. But success in such matters always came with a price. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Whispers about the strange plants she cultivated in her garden, about the odd hours she kept, about the unusual ceremonies some claimed to have witnessed from a distance. The Rogers children reflected their parents' complex nature. Jonathan, at 17, was the eldest, a young man caught between childhood and the harsh realities of war. Tall like his father, but with his mother's dark eyes, Jonathan had grown increasingly restless as the conflict intensified around them. Neighbors reported seeing him at odd hours, riding the mountain trails, with a purposefulness that suggested more than casual wandering. Some claimed Jonathan had been recruited by Confederate bushwhackers, those irregular fighters who struck Union sympathizers and federal forces with lightning raids before melting back into the wilderness. Others insisted he was secretly aiding Union forces, providing information about Confederate movements through the region. The truth, like so much about the Rogers family, remained shrouded in mystery. Elias, the second son at 14, was Jonathan's opposite in temperament. Where his older brother was active and increasingly militant, Elias was contemplative, bookish, and prone to spending long hours writing in a leather-bound journal his mother had given him. Those few neighbors who had spoken with the boy described him as unusually articulate for his age, possessing a vocabulary that seemed far beyond his years and mountain upbringing. What Elias wrote in that journal would remain forever unknown. Like everything else belonging to the Rogers family, it was consumed in the flames that December night, leaving only speculation about what thoughts and observations it might have contained. Mary, the only daughter at 12, was perhaps the most troubling member of the family in the eyes of their neighbors. A pale, serious child with her mother's dark eyes and an unsettling habit of staring at things others couldn't see, Mary had gained a reputation for what people carefully termed second sight. She was said to predict storms days before they arrived, to know when visitors were approaching long before they came into view, and to speak of events that had not yet occurred with disturbing accuracy. More troubling still were the episodes that seemed to grip the child with increasing frequency as she grew older. Neighbors reported seeing Mary standing motionless in the Rogers yard, her eyes wide and unseeing, speaking in a voice that didn't sound like her own. The words she uttered during these episodes were often incomprehensible, but those who heard them swore they felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain weather. The youngest Rogers child was an infant whose name was never recorded in any official document, referred to only as the baby in the few surviving accounts of the family. Born in the spring of 1863, this child had lived only 8 months before perishing in the flames that consumed the Rogers cabin. Of all the victims of that terrible night, perhaps none was more innocent than this unnamed infant whose brief life ended in circumstances that defy explanation. As autumn gave way to winter in 1863, the atmosphere around the Rogers homestead grew increasingly tense. Neighbors who had once sought Eliza's remedies began to avoid the hollow entirely, claiming they felt watched whenever they approached. Those brave enough to maintain contact with the family reported disturbing changes in their behavior and demeanor. Thomas Rogers, never talkative, had become virtually silent, acknowledging visitors with little more than grunts and nods. His work around the homestead grew sporadic and careless, as if his attention was focused on matters invisible to others. The fields that had once been carefully tended showed signs of neglect, and the cabin itself began to take on a run-down appearance that suggested its occupants had lost interest in maintaining their home. Eliza's herb garden, once the pride of her domestic efforts, had been allowed to grow wild and strange. Plants that neighbors didn't recognize began to appear among the familiar medicinal herbs, species that seemed to thrive in the mountain soil despite the approaching winter. Some visitors claimed these unknown plants gave off an odor that was both sweet and somehow wrong, like flowers blooming in a graveyard. The children, too, showed signs of the growing tension. Jonathan's absences became more frequent and prolonged, and when he did return home, neighbors reported hearing heated arguments echoing across the hollow. Elias retreated further into his writing, becoming so absorbed in his journal that he seemed unaware of the world around him. Mary's strange episodes increased in frequency and intensity, and more than one neighbor reported seeing the child standing in the yard at all hours, speaking to invisible companions in that eerie, not quite her own voice. It was during this period that the first direct threats against the Rogers family began to surface. The exact nature of these threats remains unclear, but survivors from the region later reported hearing rumors that the family had been marked for punishment by one or more of the armed groups operating in the area. Some claimed Confederate irregulars suspected Thomas of Union sympathies, while others insisted Union forces had identified the family as Confederate collaborators. More disturbing were the whispers that suggested the threats came from neither military source. These rumors spoke of local residents who had grown suspicious of Eliza's practices, who saw in the family's increasing isolation and strange behavior evidence of something far more sinister than political disloyalty. In a time when fear and superstition ran rampant, when the normal social structures had broken down under the pressure of war, it was perhaps inevitable that such suspicions would eventually find violent expression. The Springfield Republican, in its December 15, 1863 edition, carried a brief item that may have been connected to the growing tension around the Rogers homestead. Under the headline, "Mysterious Disturbances in the Hills," the paper reported that citizens of the mountain districts have complained of strange lights and sound emanating from remote hollows, leading to speculation about irregular military activities, or worse. While the Rogers family was not mentioned by name, the timing and geographic references suggest their hollow may have been among those cited in these complaints. As December deepened and the first heavy snows began to fall, the Rogers family found themselves increasingly cut off from the outside world. The mountain trails that connected their hollow to the nearest settlements became treacherous with ice and snow, making travel dangerous even for those familiar with the terrain. This isolation, which Thomas Rogers had once sought as a blessing, now seemed more like a curse, trapping the family in their remote cabin as unknown dangers gathered around them. It was during this period of enforced solitude that neighbors began to report the most disturbing phenomena yet associated with the Rogers homestead. Travelers passing near Red Hollow spoke of seeing lights moving through the bare trees at night, not the steady glow of lanterns or candles, but dancing, flickering illumination that seemed to move with purpose through the darkness. Some claimed to hear voices carried on the winter wind, speaking in languages that sounded like no earthly tongue. More troubling still were the reports of visitors to the Rogers cabin during these final weeks. Several neighbors claimed to have seen groups of riders approaching the hollow under cover of darkness, though none could say with certainty who these mysterious visitors might have been or what business they had with the increasingly reclusive family. The Rogers themselves never spoke of such visits, maintaining their silence even when directly questioned about the strange comings and goings around their homestead. As Christmas approached, the isolation around Red Hollow seemed to deepen into something almost palpable. The very air in the hollow felt different to those brave enough to venture near, thick and oppressive despite the crisp winter weather. Animals, normally abundant in the Ozark forests, seemed to avoid the area entirely, as if some instinct warned them away from whatever was building toward its climax in that remote cabin. The night of December 20th, 1863, would prove to be the last peaceful evening the Rogers family would ever know. Neighbors later recalled that the hollow seemed unusually quiet that night, with none of the strange lights or sounds that had become commonplace in recent weeks. It was as if the very mountains were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to begin. Mrs. Hendricks, whose testimony would prove crucial to later investigations, remembered waking sometime around midnight with an inexplicable sense of dread. She lay in her own warm bed, miles away from Red Hollow, but felt as if some invisible presence was watching her through the darkness. Unable to return to sleep, she wrapped herself in a quilt and sat by her window, staring out at the snow-covered ridges that separated her homestead from the Rogers cabin. It was shortly after 2 in the morning when she first saw the glow. At first, she thought it might be the moon breaking through the clouds, but the light was too red, too angry for moonlight. As she watched, the glow grew brighter and more intense, rising from the direction of Red Hollow like a second dawn breaking in the middle of the night. Then came the screaming. The sound that shattered the winter silence was unlike anything Mrs. Hendricks had ever heard. It was not the voice of one person, but many voices joined together in a chorus of agony that seemed to echo from the very stones of the mountains themselves. The screaming rose and fell like a demonic song, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers, before swelling again to volumes that made the windows of her cabin rattle in their frames. What made the experience truly terrifying was its durati. House fires, even devastating ones, burn quickly and die down within hours. But the screaming from Red Hollow continued throughout the night, growing neither weaker nor stronger, maintaining its horrific intensity until the first rays of true dawn began to creep over the eastern ridges. Other neighbors reported similar experiences that night, though none were willing to investigate while the sounds continued. James Morrison, whose homestead lay to the south of Red Hollow, later testified that he had gathered his family in their cabin's main room and spent the night with a loaded rifle across his knees, certain that whatever was happening in the hollow would eventually spread to threaten his own household. Sarah Wickham, a widow living alone on the western slope of the ridge, claimed that the screaming was accompanied by other sounds. The thundering of many hooves, as if a cavalry regiment was charging through the hollow, and a roaring noise that she described as, like all the waterfalls in creation, turned loose at once. Most disturbing of all was her claim that she could hear individual voices within the general cacophony, calling out names and pleas that made her weep even as they filled her with terror. When morning finally came, bringing with it a silence that seemed almost as ominous as the previous night's chaos, a small group of neighbors gathered the courage to investigate. Led by Morrison and two other local men, they made their way through the snow-covered trails toward Red Hollow, expecting to find the Rogers cabin reduced to smoldering ruins and perhaps the bodies of the family lying in the wreckage. What they found was far more disturbing than they had anticipated. The cabin was indeed gone, reduced to a foundation of blackened stones and a pile of ash that seemed impossibly fine and white against the snow. But there was something wrong with the scene that none of the investigators could immediately identify. It was Morrison who first put their unease into words. "Where's the smoke? Even the most completely consumed building leaves behind debris that continues to smolder for hours or even days after the flames die down." But the Rogers cabin site showed no sign of ongoing combustion. No wisps of smoke rose from the ashes, no heat shimmer disturbed the air above the ruins. It was as if the fire had burned so completely and so quickly that it had consumed not just the building and its contents, but even the normal byproducts of combustion itself. More disturbing still was the complete absence of any human remains. The investigators spread out across the site, carefully sifting through the ashes with sticks and improvised tools, searching for any trace of the 5 people who had lived in the cabin. They found nothing, no bones, no teeth, no metal objects that might have survived the flames. It was as if the Rogers family had never existed at all. The snow around the cabin site told its own troubling story. The investigators found evidence of many horses and riders, far more than could be accounted for by any single group they knew to be operating in the area. The tracks seemed to converge on the cabin from multiple directions, suggesting a coordinated attack. But they also showed something else that made no sense. Many of the tracks appeared to lead away from the cabin site and simply vanish, as if the riders had somehow taken to the air. Even more puzzling was the pattern of the fire damage itself. Experienced frontiersmen all, the investigators knew what buildings looked like after they had been deliberately burned by raiders. Such fires typically showed evidence of accelerants, started in multiple locations and spreading in predictable patterns. But the Rogers cabin seemed to have burned from the inside out, with the most intense damage at the center of the structure and gradually decreasing toward the edges. The foundation stones, which have been merely blackened by the flames, showed signs of heat so intense that some had actually cracked and split. Several stones near what had been the cabin's center bore marks that looked almost like handprints, as if someone had pressed their palms against the rock while it was hot enough to leave permanent impressions. As word of the Rogers family's fate spread through the region, it attracted the attention of what passed for law enforcement in those chaotic times. Sheriff William Crawford, operating out of the temporary county seat established in a commandeered schoolhouse, arrived at Red Hollow 3 days after the fire with a small group of deputies and militia volunteers. Crawford was a veteran of frontier law enforcement, a man who had dealt with claim jumpers, horse thieves, and every variety of violent criminal the frontier could produce. But even his experienced eye could make little sense of what he found at the Rogers homestead. His official report, filed with the territorial authorities and later preserved in the state archives, makes for disturbing reading even today. The destruction is complete and appears to have been accomplished by means unknown to this investigator, Crawford wrote. No bodies or remains have been recovered despite extensive searching. The pattern of fire damage suggests combustion of an intensity and thoroughness beyond what might be expected from normal causes. Tracks in the vicinity indicate the presence of numerous mounted individuals, but their identity and purpose remain unclear. Crawford's investigation was complicated by the broader military situation in the region. Just days before the Rogers fire, Confederate cavalry under the command of Joseph O. Shelby had been reported operating in the area, conducting raids against Union sympathizers and supply lines. Shelby's men were known for their ruthless efficiency and their willingness to use extreme measures against those they considered enemies of the Confederate cause. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Several witnesses reported seeing large groups of armed riders in the days leading up to the fire, and the thoroughness of the destruction suggested military rather than civilian involvement. Crawford initially pursued this line of investigation, sending messages to Union commanders in the region requesting information about recent Confederate activities. But as the investigation continued, evidence began to emerge that complicated the simple explanation of a military raid. Shelby's men, brutal though they could be, typically left their victims' bodies as a warning to others. The complete absence of remains at the Rogers site was inconsistent with known Confederate tactics. Moreover, several witnesses came forward to report that they had seen Shelby's cavalry moving through a different part of the territory on the night of the fire, making it unlikely that his men were responsible for the Rogers family's fate. Union forces operating in the area also came under suspicion. The Rogers family's isolation and Thomas's rumored Confederate sympathies could have made them targets for federal troops seeking to deny aid and comfort to irregular Confederate forces. But here, too, the evidence failed to support a simple military explanation. Union commanders, when questioned, insisted that their forces had been engaged elsewhere on the night in question, and military records seemed to support their claims. As the investigation expanded, Crawford and his team began to uncover a more complex and disturbing picture of the events leading up to the fire. Neighbors who had initially been reluctant to speak began to share their observations about the Rogers family's increasingly strange behavior in the weeks before their deaths. Tales emerged of midnight visitors, strange ceremonies, and phenomena that seemed to defy rational explanation. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who had occasionally been called to attend patients in the mountain districts, provided perhaps the most credible testimony about the family's final weeks. Webb had been summoned to the Rogers cabin in early December to treat the infant, who had been suffering from what Eliza described as wasting sickness. What he found there disturbed him far more than the child's illness. The atmosphere in that cabin was unlike anything I had experienced in 20 years of frontier medicine, Webb later wrote to a colleague. The family seemed to be living under some tremendous strain, jumping at the slightest sound and exchanging glances that suggested they were keeping secrets from an outsider like myself. The cabin itself felt wrong somehow. as if the very air inside had been poisoned by fear or worse. Webb's description of his examination of the infant was particularly troubling. The child showed signs of severe malnutrition, but not the kind typically associated with poverty or food scarcity. It was as if the infant was failing to thrive despite adequate nourishment, as if some vital force was being drained from the child by unknown means. Most disturbing of all were the marks I found on the child's arms and legs, small puncture wounds that appeared to be healing, suggesting they were inflicted repeatedly over time. When Webb questioned Eliza about these marks, her response had been evasive and deeply unsettling. She claimed they were the result of medical treatments she was administering, but she refused to specify what those treatments entailed or why they required such invasive procedures on an infant. When I pressed her for details, she became agitated and insisted that I wouldn't understand the necessities imposed by their situation. Webb's testimony added a new dimension to the investigation, suggesting that whatever had happened to the Rogers family might have begun long before the night of the fire. The physician's description of the family's behavior and the mysterious marks on the infant painted a picture of people living in fear of something far more immediate and personal than the distant war raging across the region. Other witnesses came forward with similar accounts of disturbing changes in the Rogers family during their final weeks. A traveling preacher named Reverend Isaiah McKinnon reported encountering Jonathan Rogers on the mountain trails in late November, describing the young man as wild-eyed and speaking of matters that chilled my Christian soul. According to McKinnon, Jonathan had approached him on a lonely stretch of trail and engaged him in conversation that quickly turned to theological matters. The boy questioned me about the nature of sin and redemption, but not in the manner of one seeking spiritual guidance. Rather, he seemed to be testing my knowledge, as if evaluating whether I possessed information he needed. When I attempted to turn the conversation toward his family's spiritual welfare, he became evasive and eventually rode away without explanation. More disturbing still was McKinnon's account of the questions Jonathan had asked. He inquired about biblical passages dealing with sacrifice and atonement, particularly those involving the shedding of blood. When I asked why such matters concerned him, he replied that his family had made commitments that required fulfillment, regardless of the cost. The way he spoke of these commitments suggested they were not obligations to any earthly authority. The preacher's testimony was corroborated by other travelers who had encountered members of the Rogers family during the weeks leading up to the fire. A merchant named Samuel Hartley reported a disturbing conversation with Eliza Rogers at a general store in a nearby settlement. According to Hartley, Eliza had purchased several items that seemed unusual for a frontier housewife. Large quantities of salt, various herbs he didn't recognize, and several yards of white cloth that she insisted must be completely free of any dyes or markings. When Hartley had jokingly asked if she was planning a wedding, Eliza's response had been anything but light-hearted. She looked at me with those dark eyes of hers and said that white was the proper color for endings as well as beginnings. Then she asked if I believed in the power of blood to wash away sins. The way she asked it wasn't like a normal religious question. It was as if she was speaking from personal knowledge of such matters. As these testimonies accumulated, Sheriff Crawford began to suspect that the Rogers family's fate might have been connected to activities that had nothing to do with the Civil War or conventional criminal activity. The evidence suggested a family that had become involved in practices that were both secretive and dangerous, practices that might have ultimately led to their destruction. But even as this darker picture emerged, crucial questions remained unanswered. If the Rogers family had indeed been involved in some form of occult or ritualistic activity, who were their associates? Were they the perpetrators of their own destruction, or had they fallen victim to others who shared their dangerous interests? And most puzzling of all, what had happened to their bodies? The investigation took another disturbing turn when Crawford's team discovered evidence of previous fires in Red Hollow. A more thorough search of the area revealed the remains of at least 2 other structures that had been destroyed by fire in recent years. These earlier incidents had gone unreported, hidden in the hollow's remote location and the chaos of wartime. But they suggested that the Rogers cabin fire might have been part of a larger pattern of destruction. The oldest of these fire sites appeared to date back several years, possibly to the time when the Rogers family had first settled in the hollow. The remains were too degraded to provide much information, but they showed the same pattern of unusually complete combustion that had marked the Rogers cabin. Like the more recent fire, these earlier incidents had left behind no human remains, despite evidence that the structures had been occupied at the time of their destruction. Local Cherokee, some of whom still maintained camps in the remote mountains despite official removal policies, provided additional perspective on the hollow's dark history. An elderly Cherokee woman named Ayanna, who served as a healer and keeper of tribal memory, agreed to speak with Crawford through an interpreter. Her testimony added yet another layer of mystery to the already complex case. According to Ayanna, Red Hollow had been considered a place of power and danger by her people for generations before white settlers arrived in the region. The Cherokee name for the location translated roughly as the place where the earth bleeds. And tribal tradition held that it was a site where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was particularly thin. My grandmother's grandmother told stories of that place, Ayanna explained through the interpreter. She said that sometimes the earth there would grow warm without reason, and that plants would grow in patterns that spelled out messages in the old writing. She said that those who chose to build their homes there did so because they sought to traffic with powers that wise people avoided. More disturbing still was Ayanna's claim that the Cherokee had occasionally seen lights and heard sounds from Red Hollow even before any white families had settled there. According to tribal oral history, these phenomena had been occurring for generations, suggesting that whatever dark force haunted the hollow was not connected to any specific family or individual, but rather to the location itself. The earth there is hungry, Ayanna concluded. It feeds on those who come to it seeking power, and it is never satisfied. My people learned long ago to avoid that place, especially when the moon is dark and the veil between worlds grows thin. This testimony forced Crawford to consider possibilities that challenged his rational, law enforcement-trained worldview. Could the Rogers family's fate be connected to supernatural forces rather than human agency? Was Red Hollow itself somehow responsible for the pattern of mysterious fires and disappearances? As winter deepened and the investigation continued, these questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Despite extensive searches and interviews, no conventional explanation for the Rogers family's fate had emerged. The evidence pointed in multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting military action, occult involvement, and supernatural intervention in equal measure. The few physical clues discovered at the site only deepened the mystery. Among the ashes of the cabin, investigators found several objects that had somehow survived the intense fire that had consumed everything else. These artifacts were as puzzling as they were disturbing. The first was a small iron pendant, roughly circular in shape and bearing symbols that none of the investigators could identify. The pendant showed no signs of fire damage despite being found in the center of the burn area, where the heat had been most intense. When Crawford showed the pendant to local clergy and educated residents, none could provide any insight into the meaning of its strange markings. The second artifact was even more disturbing. A human tooth, perfectly preserved and showing no signs of the Fire that should have reduced it to ash, along with the rest of the Rogers family's remains. The tooth appeared to belong to a child, possibly Mary Rogers, but forensic science of the 1860s was too primitive to provide any definitive identification. Most puzzling of all was a section of floorboard that had somehow survived the fire intact. The wood showed clear scorch marks around its edges, proving it had been present during the conflagration, but the center of the board was unmarked by flame. Carved into this preserved section were symbols similar to those found on the iron pendant, along with what appeared to be dates stretching back several years. These artifacts suggested that whatever had happened to the Rogers family might have been planned and prepared for over an extended period. The symbols implied some form of ritualistic or ceremonial component to their fate, while the preserved dates hinted at a timeline of events that had culminated in the December fire. Dr. Josiah Blackwood, a professor of ancient languages at a college in St. Louis, was consulted about the mysterious symbols. His analysis, conducted through correspondence since travel to the remote investigation site was impractical, provided additional disturbing insights into the case. According to Blackwood, the symbols bore resemblance to various ancient protective and summoning sigils drawn from traditions ranging from European witchcraft to Middle Eastern mysticism. The markings suggest an eclectic approach to occult practice, he wrote to Crawford, combining elements from multiple traditions in ways that indicate either extensive study or guidance from someone well-versed in such matters. Blackwood's analysis was particularly troubling in its implications about the timeline of events. If these symbols were indeed carved over the period suggested by the accompanying dates, they represent a sustained occult working of considerable complexity. Such practices typically build toward a specific culmination, often involving sacrifice or other extreme measures. The fire that consumed the Rogers family may have been the intended conclusion of whatever ritual they were attempting to complete. As news of these discoveries spread through the region, public reaction ranged from skepticism to outright terror. Church congregations held special prayer meetings to ward off evil influences, while some families began making plans to abandon their homesteads rather than risk whatever fate had befallen the Rogers family. The local newspaper, such as it was during wartime, published an editorial calling for calm and rational investigation of the incident. While the circumstances surrounding the Rogers family's death are indeed mysterious and disturbing, the editor wrote, we must not allow superstition and fear to overcome our commitment to truth and justice. There is undoubtedly a rational explanation for these events, and continued investigation will eventually bring it to light. But even as community leaders called for calm, reports of strange phenomena in and around Red Hollow continued to accumulate. Travelers reported seeing lights moving through the hollow at night, always in groups of 5, the same number as the Rogers family members who had perished in the fire. Others claimed to hear voices calling out from the hollow, sometimes in English, but often in languages they couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all were the reports from those brave or foolish enough to venture into the hollow itself. These witnesses described an atmosphere of oppressive dread that seemed to grow stronger as one approached the ruins of the Rogers cabin. Some claimed to feel invisible hands touching them, or to hear whispered words spoken directly into their ears. Several reported experiencing vivid hallucinations or visions that seemed to show the Rogers family's fin, all moments in horrific detail. Winter gave way to spring, and still the investigation continued without reaching any definitive conclusions. Sheriff Crawford, worn down by months of pursuing leads that led nowhere and evidence that defied explanation, began to consider the possibility that the case might never be solved. In his final official report, filed in April of 1864, he acknowledged the limits of conventional law enforcement in dealing with such mysterious circumstances. After extensive investigation involving multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and consultation with various experts, this office has been unable to determine the precise cause of the fire that destroyed the Rogers family homestead, or the fate of the 5 individuals who perished therein, Crawford wrote. The evidence suggests the involvement of unknown parties using methods that fall outside the normal patterns of criminal activity. Until such time as new evidence emerges or witnesses come forward with additional information, the case must be considered unresolved. Crawford's admission of defeat marked the end of official efforts to solve the Rogers family mystery. But it did not end public fascination with the case. As the Civil War drew to a close and some semblance of normal life returned to the Ozark region, the story of the family that had burned alive in Red Hollow began to take on the characteristics of legend. Local storytellers embellished the tale with each telling, adding details that may or may not have been rooted in fact. Some versions of the story claimed that Jonathan Rogers had made a pact with dark forces in exchange for his family's safety during the war, only to have that pact turn against them when payment came due. Others insisted that Eliza Rogers had been a witch whose powers had grown beyond her ability to control, ultimately consuming her and her family in supernatural flames. The most persistent version of the legend held that the Rogers family had not died in the fire at all, but had been transformed by whatever dark forces they had summoned. According to this telling, the 5 figures sometimes seen moving through Red Hollow at night were not ghosts, but the Rogers family themselves, cursed to wander the hollow for eternity as punishment for their trafficking with forbidden powers. These stories spread throughout the Ozark Mountains, passed down from parents to children, and shared around campfires on dark nights. The tale of the Rogers family became a cautionary story about the dangers of isolation, the perils of dabbling in forces beyond human understanding, and the price of seeking power through forbidden means. As years passed, and the immediate trauma of the Civil War began to fade, academic interest in the Rogers case began to emerge. Folklore collectors and historians studying Ozark culture began to document the various versions of the story, attempting to separate fact from fiction and understand how the legend had evolved from its historical origins. One of the most thorough early studies was conducted by Professor Samuel Morrison of the University of Arkansas, who spent several summers in the late 1870s collecting oral histories related to the Rogers case. Morrison's work, published in 1881 as Mysteries of the Arkansas Ozarks, provided one of the first scholarly attempts to analyze the evidence surrounding the family's disappearance. Morrison's conclusions were necessarily tentative, given the limited and often contradictory nature of the available evidence. He acknowledged that conventional explanations for the family's fate were inadequate to account for all the documented phenomena, but he stopped short of endorsing supernatural theories. Instead, he suggested that the Rogers case might represent an example of mass hysteria, or collecti, the delusion in which the trauma of wartime had caused an entire community to interpret natural events in supernatural terms. The human mind, when subjected to extreme stress and uncertainty, has a remarkable capacity for creating explanations that satisfy psychological needs, even when they contradict physical reality, Morrison wrote. The Rogers family may indeed have perished in a house fire, but the community's need to understand this tragedy in terms of their existing beliefs about good and evil, sin and punishment, may have transformed a mundane, if tragic, event into something far more mysterious and significant. Morrison's rational approach to the case influenced subsequent academic treatment of the Rogers legend, but it did little to diminish popular fascination with the story. If anything, the scholarly attention seemed to validate the tale's importance and ensure its preservation for future generations. By the turn of the 20th century, the Rogers case had become one of the most widely known ghost stories in the American South. Variations of the tale appeared in published collections of folklore, magazine articles about Southern mysteries, and eventually in early radio broadcasts dedicated to supernatural subjects. Each retelling of the story added new elements or emphasized different aspects of the case. Some versions focused on the military context, presenting the Rogers family as victims of Civil War violence whose story had been distorted by time and superstition. Others emphasized the occult elements, portraying Eliza Rogers as a powerful witch whose practices had attracted the attention of dark forces beyond her control. The most enduring versions of the legend were those that combined historical fact with supernatural speculation, creating narratives that seemed plausible enough to be believed while containing elements mysterious enough to capture the imagination. These stories typically began with accurate historical information about the Civil War in the Ozarks and Toul, the confirmed facts about the Rogers family's disappearance, then gradually introduced more speculative elements as the tale progressed toward its climactic conclusion. Throughout all these retellings, certain core elements remained constant: the isolated location of Red Hollow, the complete destruction of the Rogers cabin, the absence of any remains, and the persistent reports of supernatural phenomena in the area. These consistent details gave the legend a foundation of apparent authenticity that helped it survive skeptical examination and continue to attract believers. Modern investigators have occasionally attempted to revisit the Rogers case using contemporary forensic techniques and historical research methods. These efforts have generally confirmed the basic facts of the case while failing to provide any definitive explanation for the family's fate. Archaeological excavation of the Rogers cabin site in the 1960s revealed evidence consistent with an extremely hot fire, but provided no new insights into its cause or the fate of the building's occupants. Soil analysis confirmed the presence of ash and charcoal deposits, along with traces of various metals that might have come from household items, but no organic materials that could be definitively linked to human remains. Historical research has filled in some gaps in the documentary record, confirming details about the Rogers family's background and the military situation in the Ozarks during 1863. These studies have established that Thomas Rogers did indeed serve in the Mexican-American War, and that his family did settle in Red Hollow around 1854. They have also confirmed that various military units from both sides operated in the area during the period in question, making it plausible that the family could have been caught up in the conflict. However, none of this research has provided a convincing explanation for the more mysterious aspects of the case. The complete absence of human remains, the unusual pattern of fire damage, and the persistent reports of supernatural phenomena have continued to resist rational explanation. Perhaps most intriguingly, modern research has confirmed some elements of the Cherokee oral tradition about Red Hollow. Geological surveys of the area have revealed the presence of natural gas seepage and underground mineral deposits that could account for some of the unusual phenomena reported in the hollow. The earth in certain areas does indeed run warmer than the surrounding terrain, and the soil chemistry is sufficiently unusual to affect plant growth in ways that might appear supernatural to observers unfamiliar with the underlying geology. These discoveries have led some researchers to suggest that the Rogers case might represent an early example of environmental factors being misinterpreted as supernatural phenomena. According to this theory, natural gas seepage could have contributed to an unusually intense fire, while the unique soil chemistry and geology of the hollow might have created conditions that seemed mysterious to 19th century observers, but can be explained by modern science. Yet even these scientific explanations fail to account for all aspects of the case. The complete absence of human remains, the survival of certain artifacts, while everything else was consumed, and the timing of various reported phenomena continue to puzzle investigators. Moreover, The consistent reports of supernatural activity in the Hollow, extending from Cherokee oral tradition through the present day, suggest that whatever makes Red Hollow unique has persisted across time and cultural boundaries. As we approach the conclusion of this dark tale, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that some mysteries may be destined to remain unsolved. The Rogers family's fate has resisted explanation for more than a century and a half, despite the efforts of law enforcement, scholars, and investigators armed with increasingly sophisticated tools and techniques. What we know for certain is this. On a cold December night in 1863, 5 members of the Rogers family perished in a fire that consumed their remote cabin so completely that not even their bones survived. The circumstances of their death were sufficiently unusual to inspire decades of investigation and speculation, creating a legend that has outlived the historical events that spawned it. The questions that have haunted investigators since that terrible night remain unanswered. Did Jonathan Rogers' alleged involvement with Confederate irregulars bring death to his family? Was Eliza Rogers' reputation as a practitioner of the old ways more than mere superstition? Did the family's isolation and the chaotic conditions of wartime Arkansas create an environment where darker forces could flourish unchecked? Or was their fate the result of more mundane but equally tragic circumstances? A house fire made more devastating by winter conditions and wartime shortages, with the more mysterious elements of the story created by the traumatized imaginations of neighbors seeking to make sense of an incomprehensible loss? The evidence, such as it is, supports multiple interpretations. The historical record confirms that the Rogers family existed, lived in Red Hollow, and died in a fire that consumed their cabin. It also confirms that their deaths occurred during a period of extreme violence and social upheaval, when normal patterns of law and order had broken down across much of the American frontier. Beyond these basic facts, however, the case dissolves into speculation and legend. The testimony of witnesses, while consistent in many details, was gathered under traumatic circumstances and filtered through the cultural beliefs and prejudices of frontier Arkansas in the 1860s. The physical evidence, while intriguing, is susceptible to multiple interpretations and has been contaminated by more than a century of exposure to the elements and human interference. What remains is a story that continues to fascinate and disturb those who encounter it. The Rogers case has become more than a historical mystery. It has evolved into a modern myth that speaks to our deepest fears about isolation, the unknown, and the price of trafficking with forces beyond our understanding. In Red Hollow itself, the legend lives on. Local residents still report strange phenomena in the area, and the occasional brave or foolish visitor still ventures into the hollow seeking evidence of the supernatural. The foundation stones of the Rogers cabin remain visible to this day, blackened and cracked, but still marking the spot where 5 people met their mysterious fate on that terrible December night more than 150 years ago. Perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion to this dark tale. The Rogers family may be gone, consumed by flames that burned hotter and more completely than any natural fire should burn. But their story continues to cast shadows across the Ozark Mountains. In campfire tales and whispered conversations, in scholarly articles and paranormal investigations, the mystery of what happened in Red Hollow in 1863 refuses to die. And on still winter nights, when the wind howls through the bare trees and the moon hangs pale and distant above the ridges, some say you can still hear the echoes of that terrible screaming, carrying across the years like a warning to those who might be tempted to follow in the Rogers family's footsteps. The Hollow remembers, and perhaps it always will, keeping its secrets hidden in the darkness, while the legend of the family that burned alive continues to haunt the mountains they once called home. The Rogers case stands as a reminder that even in our modern age of scientific explanation and rational inquiry, there remain mysteries that resist our efforts to solve them. Some questions may have no answers, some shadows may never yield to the light, and some stories may be destined to remain forever suspended between history and legend, truth and terror. In the end, the fate of the Rogers family serves as both mystery and metaphor, a tale of how quickly the familiar can become strange, how easily the living can become legend, and how the past continues to reach across time to trouble our dreams with echoes of ancient fears and forgotten terrors. The fire that consumed their cabin may have died out long ago, but the story it created continues to burn, fueled by our endless fascination with the unknown and our eternal need to find meaning in the face of inexplicable tragedy. And so the legend endures, passed down from generation to generation, like a warning carved in smoke and shadow, reminding us that there are still places in this world where darkness gathers, where the earth itself may hunger for sacrifice, and where those who seek power through forbidden means may find themselves consumed by the very forces they attempted to control. The Rogers family's story is far from over. It lives on in every telling, grows stronger with each passing year, and waits patiently in the hollow for the next chapter to begin. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.